Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to have Yuki back with us. This is a really honor for me because Yuki has supported many of our events in the past and has done a really great job of explaining a lot about what the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero does, GFANZ. But in general, Yuki has had a really great career in the space, really advocating for change within the sustainable finance space and in the finance sector in general. And I'll let Yuki give an overview about herself and more about what work GFANZ does, but I'm really, really honored that you could be here again, and I'm very grateful that you are continuing to support our work of empowering future leaders. Yuki, thank you so much, and please take it away.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here, and thanks very much, Stephen, for inviting me to speak today. So I'll talk a little bit about my background and then introduce GFANZ. So I originally did a bachelor's in economics, and then my first career was in chartered accountant. So I was at PwC for the first 5 years, and I qualified as a UK chartered accountant. And then after receiving my qualification, I was wondering what to do next because, you might know that about half the people leave the profession and go into industry, but I wanted to do something more on using the accountancy skill for sustainable development. So I went into a master's course on environmental change and management and moved into UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme's Finance Initiative, which is one of the oldest voluntary initiatives on sustainable finance. And I was there 16 years in Geneva and 4 years in Bangkok, and then joined GFANZ 2 years ago. So it's been a really incredible journey of over nearly 22 years now in sustainable finance, where I guess at the time it was a very small community of people working on sustainable finance, and today it's a huge global community where there's lots and lots of opportunity. I guess when I started, sustainable finance was very limited. The roles and the positions were really limited. Today, I think it's across financial institutions, and it's not a couple of people per institution, but a whole army of people using sustainable finance on a day-to-day basis, even if they're not, a complete expert on sustainable finance. So I see it as similar to how digitalization is evolving, where, you've got IT experts in an organization, but everyone needs to use a computer. And I think sustainable finance is getting there to the stage that you, even if sustainable finance is not your 100% of your job, that you require sustainable finance skills and understanding on a day-to-day basis, even at different functions, like say relations manager in a corporate banking division, something like that. So I'll explain what GFANZ does in this kind of era where mainstreaming of sustainable finance is very prevalent today, and to showcase what our priorities are in this space at the moment. So let me share my screen. So you might or might not know GFANZ, so I'll give you a quick introduction. So GFANZ was set up by Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney, who used to be the governor of the Bank of England. And they set it up just before COP26 in 2021. And it is a association of associations, as it were, on net zero for financial institutions. So we are an umbrella of 9 financial institution net zero alliances, such as Net Zero Banking Alliance or the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And today there is 9 of those that we kind of recognize as part of the GFANZ community. In this slide, it says that there's 675 plus financial institutions around the world in 50 jurisdictions around the world. But actually, even just taking a look at Asia, the numbers are actually much more. So here we did a recent count for GFANZ in Asia, and there's about 96 alliance members across 13 Asian markets. And the biggest community is Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Singapore, where we have more than 50% of market penetration in these markets. But we do have a big gap in the rest of Asia, especially emerging markets and developing economies. So what GFANZ tries to do is, so you might have heard of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which also was set up by Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney. And at that time, around 2015, when they set it up, the focus was trying to understand the systemic risk of climate change and how that translated into the financials in the economy and in the financial system. We've gone from there to here, where we have now got a fair understanding of the risk of climate change. And the next stage is that we really need to take action to really mitigate that risk and manage that risk. So where we have come to is the understanding that actually the only solution that we have is really to tackle the climate change crisis together, not just the financial sector, but of course the real economy. And the idea is that finance really needs to go where the emissions are and to support the transition of the decarbonization of the real economy. So there are 4 types of financing that GFANZ identifies as requiring financing for net zero, and that the current finances actually go into none of them, but there's a first bucket, which is business as usual. And the idea is that the whole financial institution needs to be mobilized to mainstream finance to go into these 4 different types of buckets. That doesn't mean that all financial institutions have to assign finance to all these 4 equally. They can, depending on their risk appetite and where they are globally in the region, they may have more emphasis in certain buckets than the others. And in Asia, we recognize that actually a lot of the current economy needs to be under 3 and 4, which is that we have a lot of high-emitting industries that need to be aligning and then eventually aligned towards net zero, and that there's a lot of high-emitting assets in our economy that needs an accelerated phase out to meet and contribute to the 1.5 degree global goals. So in order to do that, we are also working a lot around the net zero transition plan. And this, you might have started to hear about net zero transition planning more because we see a lot of regulators talking about it these days. You might have before only heard about like taxonomies, which kind of explain some of the buckets that we were looking at. But today, there's more emphasis on actually how to actually get that finance flowing into these 4 types of financing. And as I was saying earlier, what we're looking for is no longer a small niche of finance that goes towards like green bonds or green projects, but actually we need a whole financial institution approach in mainstreaming finance to go into those 4 buckets, which means that you need a whole institutional transition in order to provide that kind of scale of financing. And so it's essentially about the need for both the real economy companies as well as financial institutions to really shift their business strategy towards net zero, and the way they do business and the way they engage with their clients or their supply chain is fundamentally restructured. So looking at the implementation strategy on this slide, I always say that the implementation strategy and the engagement strategy is the supply and demand of finance. So for the financial institutions, the implementation strategy is to say, what kind of products and services would I need to provide to my customers to enable me to provide financing towards those 4 buckets of financing that we saw earlier. And that's the supply of financing. But then at the same time, you need to engage with your clients, or if you're an investor, your portfolio companies, to ensure that they are using or needing these products and services, and that they work with their supply chain to make sure that that happens as well. So these are like the supply and demand of the financing, and all the other things are like governance and metrics and targets are things that bring that together. Now, as I was saying earlier, there's a lot of now movement around how do we actually get these kind of financing to scale. And there is a lot of movement in G20, G7, the EU, UK. UK is the most advanced in terms of transition planning. They have they've got a legal mandate now to require larger corporations to prepare transition planning, not just financial institutions, but real economy as well. And Singapore, for example, in Asia, has issued a proposed guidelines on transition planning that will eventually be regulated for financial institutions. And of course, the ISSB also touches very lightly on the need for planning. And we think that some of the work that is done on transition planning will be the basis of their more detailed disclosure requirements to come. So where we are in APEC is that we work with financial institutions that are committed to net zero, as well as reaching out to financial institutions that are outside, the net zero alliance community. So what we do is we do 2 types of activities. With those that are committed, we are working on further developing transition finance. So just going back to the 4 financing strategies that I showed earlier, the first 2, the climate solutions and companies that are already aligned to 1.5 degrees, these are what you might recognize as like green companies or like green projects. And these are well defined and understood through EU taxonomies and other like green bonds principles by Climate Bonds Initiative and so forth. But the third and the fourth, as to what is an aligning company and what is a credible managed phase out, is not well understood and not well defined and not well financed currently. And these are the areas that we are working on at GFANZ in Asia Pacific, because as I was saying earlier, Asia, this part of the region where I am in Singapore, and the region has a lot of high-emitting sectors that are needing to be financed to come into number 3 or number 4 in this slide. So what we have been doing is working on a report called Financing the Managed Phase Out of Coal-Fired Power Plants in Asia. And I'll talk about that and trying to use that to apply to specific markets in Asia this year. And then the second part is when I started my introduction of GFANZ, I explained that outside of developed markets in Asia Pacific, we are not well covered at GFANZ. And there's only a handful of financial institutions in emerging markets and developing economies that are part of the Net Zero Alliance. So we have a lot of activities that we try and do outreach and capacity building. But at the same time, we realize that actually, no matter how much capacity building you do, it will not be well used or well utilized by the local financial institutions if there is no incentive or enabling environment for them to use these net zero tools and guidances. So we are combining our outreach efforts with public policy engagement as well, where we are working with financial regulators in Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia on trying to get them to be excited about the need for mobilizing their local domestic financial institutions in financing the transition. And we complement that with the capacity building activities as well. And we use a lot of case studies to share the information, share the experience of those that have already been doing sustainable finance, and to share that across the Asia Pacific. So in terms of capacity building, we're working quite closely with UNEP Finance Initiative, where I used to, where I'm from initially, and they have they have put together an interesting capacity building, how do you say, a capacity building framework, which they summarize as the key competencies for financial institutions on net zero. So they identified 18 different components that a financial institution will need to drive their net zero. And these are things like capabilities around commitments and targets, and then so for example, carbon accounting or climate reporting, and then there are net zero capabilities like target setting, scenario analysis, as well as implementation capabilities, which will be like transition planning, development of products and services, or engagement strategy that we were talking about earlier. So they've come up with these components, and we're working with them to try and reflect these in our capacity building opportunities as well. And just to give you a bit of a background on the work that we're doing around defining or developing transition finance around, say, this example is about how do we, what does good look like when it comes to financing the managed phase out of coal plants in Asia Pacific. So one of the reasons why the third and the fourth bucket, which is aligning companies and managed phase out, is not well defined, is partly because the need for, or the understanding of the need to finance the transition has only come about fairly recently, but also traditionally in Europe, a lot of the coal policies were about divestment, meaning that it was about pulling money out from the coal power plants and just walking away from it. But we realized that actually in Asia, a lot of the coal power plants are very young, and they will have a lot of economic life that if you just, if financial institutions just walk away, there will be other financial institutions that will be happy to take on this. As you saw, there's not that many financial institutions in Southeast Asia that are part of the Net Zero Alliance, which means there's quite a lot of local financial institutions who may be willing to take these coal power plants on, even if the international financial institutions walk away. And also, it could also go into private hands as well. And the idea is that actually it's better for Net Zero Alliance members to be proactively working with the coal-fired power plant owners to get them to accelerate their retirement and move into new business models such as renewable energy, becoming a renewable energy power producer rather than a fossil fuel-based power producer, for example. So, but in order to do that, you need to really understand what is credible, because one of the difficulties about financing the third and fourth bucket is that if you finance a hard to abate sector or a high emitting asset like coal-fired power plants, you actually can't tell whether you are financing the business as usual or really financing them to help their transition. Like, you might have an intention, but it's hard to prove that that's what you're doing from a third person's point of view, because the emissions are still there today, and that it's not like they are going to be disappearing immediately. So, like managed phase out of coal-fired power plants, the retirement is going to be over, say, the next 15 years, not tomorrow. And a shifting and a hard to abate company to go net zero is going to take another 10, 20 years as well. So understanding what is the difference between supporting a company, the same company, for net zero or supporting the business as usual, is where a lot of the definitions and guardrails and KPIs need to still be developed. And this was one of the first set of guidelines or recommendations for GFANZ that we put out around what good looks like in financing the managed phase out of coal. And you can see here that credibility of these financing does not just rest on the coal power plant's own characteristics, but also that it rests quite a lot on government level commitment of no coal, building no new coal, or what kind of energy transition plan they have as a country. And also it rests a lot on the power producers' own entity level commitments towards net zero, as well as the characteristic of the coal power plant that you're going to try and retire early as well. And also, once you understand what is credible, then the idea is that you need to maximize your impact, but taking into account two other things that also needs to come into play, which is, the first is just transition. So making sure that the managed phase out does not inadvertently mean less accessibility or less affordability of electricity, because you are taking out a power out of the economy. You need to make sure that it is replaced, maybe not directly necessarily by the same producer, but in the system that there are new sources of renewable energy coming in to make sure that the affordability, the accessibility, and the energy security is maintained, as well as the hard bit, which is how do you make sure that this is financially viable, so that commercial financial institutions can come in, and that it's not just about public finance trying to solve this. So in terms of the financial levers, there's a lot of discussion right now on how do we make it work as a transaction where commercial finance can support it, because that requires bankability. And some of the innovation in sustainable finance is very much geared towards this discussion about bankability of financing the managed phase out. And there are two there's about 5 that are on this slide. One is blended capital. So how do we make sure that the public finance becomes truly catalytic in bringing in and mobilizing private finance? And the other one that is quite promising is how do you create a new asset class, as it were, on carbon credits, which is around managed phase out, and how do we ensure the integrity of those carbon credits. So it's one thing to have an integrity or credibility around the transaction of managed phase out of coal power plants, but there is another added layer that is required for integrity carbon credits on managed phase out as well. And these carbon credits are sometimes called transition credits, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore is one of the leaders in trying to make this a integrity credit in the global market. So the other thing that I wanted to flag out in the managed phase out discussion is that a lot of the net zero committed financial institutions have already set no coal policies before managed phase out started to be flagged as an important financing that they should consider. So for a lot of those financial institutions, they actually need to go back to their internal no coal policy to see how they can refine the wording to make a distinction between financing the business as usual and financing the managed phase out. And also, at the moment, a lot of the financial institutions that are committed to net zero, their performance is determined by financed emissions. You might have heard of the word financed emissions. It's basically the amount of emissions that are related to your financing. So it's a scope 3 of a financial institution. And right now, a lot of the how financed emissions is determined is the amount of emissions that are happening today that you are enabling. But for managed phase out, you are actually enabling the reduction of emissions over time. And that kind of forward-looking financed emission does not exist today. And there's a lot of discussions at GFANZ and around the world on what kind of forward-looking metrics can we create that supplements a financed emission metric so that financial institutions do not shy away from financing managed phase out, because if you finance a coal-fired power plant's managed phase out, you're going to see a huge increase in your financed emissions, exactly like how you would be taking on a financing of a coal-fired power plant's business as usual. And this one is another example of how we are developing transition finance in Asia. So the other thing that we have a Japan chapter that was launched in June last year. And one of the first things that they have been working on is a contribution to a global report called Scaling Transition Finance and Real Economy Decarbonization that was launched in December at COP last year. And there they've contributed to a small section in the aligning companies' attributes, where they have tried to provide some extra guardrails around companies that are thinking of using what we call transitional activities in their transition journey. So transition journeys are quite controversial because they are things like replacing a diesel to LNG and then thinking of going to hydrogen. So transitional meaning that they are kind of intermediary technologies that are still fossil fuel, but is a little bit better than, say, coal or diesel. And that these are supposed to bring down the emissions to some extent, but they are still fossil fuel based and have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, but that they are waiting for the next technology to come on to get to net zero. And the question is whether LNG and other transitional technologies are viable aligning, part of the aligning of a company or not, is something that is still very hotly debated especially in Asia. And the answer from GFANZ point of view is that it depends, that we need to actually look at it with some extra guardrails. And these are the guardrails that were put forward by the Japan chapter to say that, one LNG might be a credible transitional activity, but maybe in another context it may not be. And these are the 4 criteria that one can look at to understand or assess the effectiveness and the credibility of such technologies. And I will leave you with some publications and resources that we have from Asia. So the financing, the managed phase out. The other one that I've only lightly touched upon is the case study report that we have last year in June. So this report in the middle is the case study on the components of financial institutions' net zero transition plans. This year, this June, we are preparing a new report which looks at the end-to-end of financial institutions' net zero transition plans. And next year, we are hoping to supplement this by looking at how financial institutions are reading the real economy's transition plans on net zero and deciding on their financing. And the one on the right is the Scaling Transition Finance. It's a global report that looks at the attributes of what kind of attributes financial institutions should be looking at when they are reading the real economy's transition plans to determine where they can finance within the 4 financing strategies. And also talking about the forward-looking financed emission metrics that I was talking about earlier. This one is probably my last slide. We have a set of slide decks called Workshop in a Box for Net Zero Transition Planning. There's 8 modules that are around financial institutions' net zero transition plans and 3 modules around the real economy's net zero transition plans. And these are self-study resources where you can just use it by yourself to learn, or you can use it as a group and along with your peers and colleagues as well. So I think that is it, and I'll stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuki. That's really helpful information, and I really would encourage the others to take a look at those workshops in a box, as they do have a lot of helpful information, especially if you're focusing on a specific area or such. Let's open it up to questions or areas that you'd like Yuki to explore further with. Maybe as a starting point, Yuki, I'd love to ask you something I asked before to you about, will we win the race to net zero? Like, do you think that we're on target? Is there a possibility that things will be able to accelerate in the coming years as we know that we need to? And maybe from your own personal perspective, how do you stay motivated when there are a lot of things sort of pushing back against this transition, meaning that it often feels harder, like that we're not going to be able to win this race?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So you might have seen the Global Stock Take report that was issued by the IPCC, not the IPCC, UNFCCC. This is this is supposed to be a stock take report that comes every 5 years under the Paris Agreement. And the first global stock take report was issued for last COP, so 2023, where they did an assessment of the gap, the emissions gap, as it were, from where we are today and how much it needs to be to reach to 1.5 degree. And there is actually, as you say, there is a significant gap. We are behind very badly behind schedule, and there's about 40% gap to 1.5 degree. So the report warned that the window to achieve 1.5 degree is closing very fast, and that we need urgently to do two things. One is to make sure that the current NDCs, the National Determined Contributions of countries, are fully implemented, which currently is not at the moment, and that they need to ratchet up their ambition for the next iteration of the NDCs, which are supposed to come out for 2025. So I think what is really important is that it is as the report says, the opportunity is fast closing for 1.5 degree, and a lot of people are worried that it is looking more and more difficult to do that, and whether we need to be preparing for a 1.7, 2 degree, even worse case scenarios, and that scientists have at the same time started to find that climate change is moving much quicker than they had initially thought. So some of the predictions that they have made are going much quicker than they had first anticipated. So I think those kind of things mean that it is that the world we are in is more urgent, and at the same time, as you rightly point out, in the EU, I think green hushing has become kind of more prevalent, partly because the authorities have been clamping down on a lot of the greenwashing that was happening. And so there is that green hushing. At the same time, there is green hushing from the US due to the political, divide that is happening in the US, which is a bit more political there. But it has affected some of the financial institutions, especially those in the US and those that have business in the US. At the same time, though, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act of the US, has made a huge progress on investing in renewables, new technologies, hydrogen, battery storage, and others. And that has, at the same time, really ramped up the investment in the US. So we're kind of seeing both, these things happening at the same time. And I guess for financial institutions, they are, they're pretty kind of in a narrow line where, you've got things happening on the left-hand side and things happening on the right-hand side, and it's hard to know where they need to be. But I think the overall message that we get from those that are committed to net zero is that the science is quite clear. There is only one kind of future, whether we make it very difficult for us to, by making it a very disorderly way to get there, or we make it as orderly as possible, is kind of up to us. And those that are moving fast are those that kind of say that have an interest in making sure that it's a bit more orderly than disorderly. So I'm quite positive that, I mean, I guess the thing is that there's no actual real alternative. So we need to solve this. So whether we do it, dragging our feet or not, it's gonna has to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, well said. And I think from our other guests, that was something that has been repeated over and over, that this is happening whether we like it or not. And it's really up to us as leaders to help facilitate it happening. Camille posted in the chat a question where he's asking, what are the biggest challenges we are facing in reducing financed emissions? Do challenges differ in the global north versus the global south?
Yeah, I think there is differences in regions. for example, as I was saying, Asia Pacific network of GFANZ is focusing very much on the dirty sectors, as it were, the brown economy and helping them to go green. So we're very much thinking about the credibility and the impact. How do we ensure those two come together? And also, there's a lot about how do we get blended finance to really work as well. In our Latin American network, there's a lot more emphasis on how do we ensure nature-based solutions are ramped up, and that we have that we are able to make sure that the nature is on our side to provide us with the solutions. And in Africa, there's a lot more discussion in our African network about how do we make sure that adaptation and mitigation come hand in hand, and that they are and that the economic development and the emission reduction are decoupled, so that it is that there is still a lot of opportunities, and that the decarbonization is actually their growth path. I think that that is actually a common theme that we see in the global south, where we're trying to make sure that this is not sacrificing the opportunities for the emerging market to grow, but rather that this is their future of their growth. That I think, a lot of the excitement in Vietnam or Laos or even Indonesia on net zero is coming from the fact that they see a lot of potential and a kind of national competitiveness around the net zero future. And I don't know if you know Laos, but Laos is a very poor, one of the more lower income countries in ASEAN, but it has a huge potential on renewable energy. And it has traditionally been relying on big dams to do hydro and sell their energy, export their energy to Thailand. But now they have started to get financing from MDBs, the multilateral development banks, as well as commercial banks, to get wind farms to generate energy, extra energy, to be sold to Vietnam, in the north of Vietnam, where there is less renewable energy sources there, as well as selling it through the Asian ASEAN grid network to other countries like Singapore as well. So you can see that they see themselves as well positioned to do that. Vietnam also sees a huge potential in south of Vietnam, where they've got a lot of offshore wind resources, and they are eyeing on exporting these. And also, in one great thing is that they can also renewable energy can be the basis of building green steel, green hydrogen, green everything, which means that these things can also, like green data centers as well, meaning that they can bring in more opportunities either to export or to bring in new industries into their countries. And Indonesia is very excited about EV potentials in their country as well, because they have some rare metals in the country that is required for the batteries and so forth.
So not only challenges, but also opportunities on this transition plan, depending on the resources available to the country.
Unfortunately, I don't think it can, we can do decarbonization and get to net zero if it's just a cost thing. It has to, for people to be excited and to work on this, and countries to be excited and work on this, it has to be a opportunity.
Absolutely. And what challenges do you see from South Asia for countries like India or for China even, as they are critical for our transition to happen?
Yeah, I think China and India are two big priority countries for engagement, and they are very different So we're still figuring out what our strategy is for China and India separately, but we have already started our engagement in China last year and starting our engagement in India. I think India is right now, their growth is amazing right now, partly due to geopolitical issues as well, probably, but also they are well positioned in the net zero economy. But because they are growing so fast, I think they are using, and it's kind of similar to China to some extent, where they're building their capacity on renewable energy very quickly, but their fossil fuel assets are also, there's a lot, and they're still trying to add that as well. So the idea is, how do we ensure that they can leapfrog and go directly to these new energy, renewable energy, without building up further on fossil fuel, as well as starting to think about how we can introduce these concepts of managed phase out and the idea of bringing the existing companies in, towards net zero as well. These are probably the biggest challenges in these countries, just because their growth is just so amazing.
Fascinating. We have a really great question from Marcella, who would love to ask it to you directly.
Hi, Yuki, and thank you so much for all the information you shared with us. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your journey into the sustainable side of finance, and touching a little bit on how was your master's experience coming from an economics background and an accounting experience, and whether you had any advice for anyone with similar backgrounds looking to further their education in the sustainable management field.
Yeah, I think so. One thing that I want to share with you is that I think you guys have got a great future ahead on sustainable finance. When I started like 22 years ago, the job opportunity was very narrow. Like, there was the UN, and then there was the NGOs, and then maybe like a very niche kind of CSR type of positions in financial institutions, and very few as well. Now, today, I think the financial institutions are quite desperate in getting talent in sustainable finance. And Singapore, for example, they just issued a interesting study and a big kind of plan to upscale their financial institution workforce in Singapore. So they reckon that nearly 60% of financial institution job roles will require moderate to significant sustainable finance knowledge in the next 2 to 3 years. And that a lot of people need to be either retrained or get people that are, newly hired that have come from that kind of background. So there's a tremendous opportunity, and they're putting aside a lot of budget towards retraining existing financial institution professions or experts to get that kind of skill. So, for example, just to give you an example, if you're a relationship manager of a commercial bank, so basically you are the point person to your client, you need to be able to talk about and understand the client's net zero journey. And if they haven't started, that you need to initiate that conversation to ask, what are they thinking, what are they, do they know, understand what kind of climate risks and opportunities they have, and how can their bank support them to implement that? That kind of role is required for every client manager or relationship manager who is in, especially who've got clients in the hard to abate sector and high emitting sectors, or in the green sectors as well. So I think those kind of things never really existed until like 5 years ago or so. and increasingly it is required. So those are like, probably it's kind of telling that the industry is looking for a lot of talent. So the scale of the need, the demand is very high. And one of the things that I realized when I was recruiting my 2 staff at APEC Network was that the salaries of these positions have become really competitive. So they're no longer, like the low, the low paid in the financial institutions, but actually one of the most competitive within the financial institutions. So I think, it is very, very important, and they expect that it's not a cost center, that what you're doing is adding value to the organization and is kind of at the heart of their business. So I think in that sense, there's a lot that a lot of potential. And coming back to like economics and accounting and these kind of things, I think in the accountancy field, so I qualified around before the millennium, so before 2000. And at that time, there was no mention of sustainability in the the newsletters that I would get. But today, every newsletter that I get from ICAW, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, is all about, there will be at least one section on climate change or SDGs or sustainability. And you can see why, because the ISSB is such a big goldmine for them. And there are so many, lots and lots of opportunities for accountants to not only look at, helping companies do more sustainability disclosure type reports, but also providing advisory service on, their transition, and they're in a big kind of, opportunity space right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an encouraging aspect for our fellows that there will be lots of opportunities going forward as it will continue to accelerate. Are there any other further questions from the group? Maybe one more before we sign off for the day. Camille, you're asking really good questions.
Yeah.
I don't know if you see it there, Yuki, but some successful case studies.
Yeah. So there is now a pilot that has been announced by ADB, the Asian Development Bank, on doing one pilot in Indonesia on managed phase out of one coal power plant, but it's still very controversial, and it hasn't completed. The financial closure hasn't been done yet, so there's still due diligence going on. And there's another one that MAS is trying to pilot in the Philippines as well. So this year we hope that there will be actual transactions that come to a close, that will be the basis of further managed phase out to come. In GFANZ APEC Network, we're trying to apply our report on managed phase out to specific markets in the region, and we're starting with the Japan market to see what is the potential of managed phase out in the Japan market, and what is the actual economics of managed phase out within the transition, to see if we can bring more awareness and interest into the managed phase out in Japan. And we're going to be trying that in other markets in Asia as well. So we do think in Asia, there's about 5,000 generators of coal power, and a lot of them will not retire naturally by 2040 or even 2050. So there is a huge potential for managed phase out, and we're still talking about the first one or two, but in the next 10 years, hopefully, by the time, say, I retire, that we should hopefully be seeing managed phase out happening every week.
That would be the dream. If the fellows wanted to learn more about the Asia Development Bank example or the Philippines example, how do they go about finding out more about these? I know you said they're in the work still and there's still a process to go, but maybe as an example to them.
ADB's one is already in the press, so you can have a look. There's actually one successful one in Philippines called ACEN, ACEN is the name of the company. And they have actually already announced their managed phase out. They're trying to still figure out how to do this and raise carbon credits out of it as well. But that's also a very good one because it actually is a one that has properly been committed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yuki. I think with that, we should give Yuki a big round of applause for joining us this morning, taking some time out from a busy schedule to share these really great resources with you all. It's really an honor to have you here, and I don't want to like diminish how much value there is by having people like you coming and joining and sharing this directly to our future finance leaders here, and hopefully inspiring them. So thank you so much, Yuki, for your time. Really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure and very nice to see you, and hope we touch base again soon. Yeah.
Would love to.
Okay.
Take care.
Great. Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.